People starting to join us. Welcome to the UCC's special briefing on Belarus. Our panel is assembled and we're just waiting for people to join us from the registration portal. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. My name is Ihor Michalchyshyn. I'm the Executive Director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And we're presenting today's special briefing, co-hosting it with the Canadian International Council. It is broadcast on Zoom for registered guests as well as on our Facebook page. We will be monitoring both to ensure that if you have a question or a comment that we can sort of feed that into the discussion. We do thank the guests for their time. We're hoping to keep the discussion to about 60 minutes so that we can have a focused discussion and allow everybody to get back to their day jobs, but we really appreciate the interest that has been shown both by our guests and our panelists to make this happen in a very short time. Obviously, a very interesting time for the world this week. So we're just going to give everybody a few more minutes to join us, and I'll start introducing folks. Oh, great! We have 85 people have popped on the line. Excellent. And we are recording and we are broadcasting on Facebook. So again, my name is Ihor Michalchyshyn. I'm the Executive Director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. I'm here in Ottawa. Joining us is a panel who I'll introduce shortly, and we're presenting this special briefing today with the Canadian International Council. As everybody here who's registered knows, it's been a very tumultuous week or two since August 9th presidential elections in Belarus. And so we've been focused on this as the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, working with other partners, and I'll introduce some of them now. The way that the format's going to work today is we're going to have each of our speakers give their presentation for about 7 to 10 minutes in order, and then we will go to questions and discussion, time dependent. If you're joining us on the line, you can, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A function. You can type in a question or a comment if you wish, and we'll moderate those with our panel. If you're watching on Facebook, we'll do our very best to keep an eye on any questions that are posted there as well. But we do, again, have a limited amount of time, so we can't promise to get to every question. So just to get started, I'm going to introduce our panel in the order in which they'll speak, and then we'll begin. So Alena Liavonchanka is the chair of the Belarusian Canadian Alliance, and she will be speaking to us on the perspectives of the Belarusian Canadian community. So there's Alena. Second, it will be Dr. Olga Onuch, University of Manchester, who will be speaking on mass mobilization and the protest movement. Third will be Dr. Alexander Lanoszka from the University of Waterloo, speaking about the potential of Russian military intervention and the future of these protests. And last, but certainly not least, is Roman Waschuk, Canada's former ambassador to Ukraine 2014 to 2019, who will give us, again, the geopolitical context and the role of Canada and our partners in supporting democracy. So that's the order in which our guests will speak. So we're going to start with Alena Liavonchanka from the Belarusian Canadian Alliance. Alena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. My name is Alena Liavonchanka. I'm the chairperson of Belarusian Canadian Alliance, which has been operating in Canada since 1948. And I'd like to start by thanking Ukrainian Congress, Ihor, and all the organizers for inviting me to speak today on behalf of many Belarusians who protested in all major Canadian cities in the past 2 weeks. We really appreciate your support, and it's great to know that other Eastern European countries and countries worldwide are standing behind the Belarusian cause. If I had to use only 3 words to describe how we feel here in Canada and other diasporas, I would say fear, pride, and anger. And it's not an easy combination to live with. Right now, a lot of us, we fear for our relatives and friends in Belarus. After brutal police crackdowns on 9th, 10th, and 11th August, at least 5 people are dead, 50 to 80 are missing, and more than 7,000 arrested. Lukashenko backed off a little bit because of mass protest, but still anyone can get arrested for as much as wearing a white ribbon or having a picture of protest on their cell phone, or just for no particular reason whatsoever, just because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So yeah, we fear for the lives and well-being of our families and friends, and also each and every brave soul on the streets of Belarus. People keep protesting despite all these brutalities, and they keep marching, and there will be mass protests in Belarus this weekend, Saturday and Sunday. So also we fear for their job security. As you may have heard, the wave of strikes has started last week in all major Belarusian cities at all major state-owned factories. And especially the workers at Minsk truck factory, they were the first who declared that they are going on strike. And then Lukashenko personally visited this factory this week, and the huge gathering of workers, they were very brave. They actually said F word to his face, which he didn't react to, and he said thank you and retracted. But now the country is paying for it. We don't have independent unions, so majority of the unions are state-controlled. And I think there is tremendous pressure on all workers who continue with strikes. This week, the workers of MAZ, another big factory in Minsk, they were physically locked down in factory buildings to prevent them from self-organizing and submitting the notice of strike. So I think this response is a vivid representation of Belarus today. People kept marching inside of the locked building and protesting and demanding the factory managements to respect the lawful protest. And overall in the country right now, the orders from above are loud and clear. Everybody who protests and who initiates strikes will be fired, and there is a lot of threats and legal pressure on strike leaders. So what we do here, we obviously help financially, we hold number of fundraisers, and overall we share information, and we try to talk to our families and relatives and friends back home and assure them that we will stand behind, and all the free world will stand behind financially and morally. We will support the strikes because that's important. Economic pressure is very important to deal with Lukashenko's regime. And also, despite being in Canada, we fear that we here are being watched, and our activism here can harm our loved ones in Belarus. We were waiting in front of Belarus embassy in Ottawa on 9th of August to vote, and we witnessed a couple of pseudo-journalists. They just appeared from nowhere and started to ask people to take off masks because we're all wearing masks due to COVID, and they started to ask people to take off masks and pose for pictures. People started challenging them with questions. Where's your accreditation? How are you going to use these pictures? And after that, they just quickly ran away, retracted, and we took a note of the car plate, but there was no follow-up. We didn't report them to police, but we think it was an attempt to basically register people who were wearing flags and protesting and wanting to vote. However, countering the fear and uncertainties is our pride that unites today all Belarusians, home and abroad. You all know that Belarusian nation did not fully crystallize as an independent democratic nation and state due to many wars and occupation regimes following one another in the past 200 years of our history. The latest chapter being Soviet Union, which was immediately followed up by Lukashenko dictatorship. And during the past 26 years, there was a small fraction of tireless activists. They were rallying for democracy and paying for it with their health, careers, and sometimes lives. Now they are national heroes. But most of the Belarusians chose an internal immigration, meaning not dealing with the state, not paying attention to politics, not participating in any activities. And a lot of people, of course, choose real immigration. Today, we are done with immigration of any kind. The nation was woken up by the shocking images and stories of police brutality victims, the deaths and the blatant insults of Lukashenko that were aired to all drunk, drugged, paid by Western enemies of state. In reality, people who protest today on streets of Belarus, they're a free-minded majority who just demands the human rights and demands an economical future for the country and for the children. So this contrast between new Belarus and the ugly agony of the old Belarus is feeding our anger. I think every day I get calls and people are saying, I'm so angry, I want to do something, I don't know what to do, but please register me in. I will participate in any action. I will sign petitions. I will help with translation. I will help with fundraisers. Please let me do anything. Otherwise, my anger is going to destroy me from inside. So we don't want Lukashenko or Putin to decide our future, that's clear. We cannot fight these two near expired dictators alone. And that's why all Belarusians abroad right now, there is a strong movement to unite and coordinate our our efforts. In Canadian community, I was just mentioning to Ihor before we started, we had two chapters in Toronto and Ottawa that were pretty active. But now we have chapters in all major Canadian cities, and I'm so happy to see that people are starting to show political initiative and they're starting to stand up for their rights. Also, we cannot do it alone, so we keep demanding all Western democracies to take a firm action and protect the democratic movement in Belarus. I want to say that our collective anger and pride was crushed by Lukashenko at least 4 times before during the past elections, and we all fear the country might not survive the 5th time. If we turn back now, the doors of Gulag will just slam behind the entire nation of 9.5 million, and it's going to be very hard to come out. So please don't let it happen. Join our protests in Canada and US this Sunday in all major cities. We are rallying together with Baltic nations, with Ukrainians, Polacks, and all Eastern European nations to commemorate the victims of communism and Nazism, and to highlight that what's going on right now in Belarus is truly Nazism, is no less than that. And we also will continue petition Canadian government to implement economical sanctions against the Belarusian regime, because we believe this is the most efficient way to stop money flow into Lukashenko's hands. And he's using this money to pay the police and special forces and to pay Russian journalists who are right now working on Belarusian TV, basically to distort the picture of what's going on and to brainwash Belarusians and all Russian-speaking communities abroad and in the post-Soviet countries. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Alena, thank you very much. Thank you for reaching out and for working with us. We were very proud to co-sign a letter with you and the Central and Eastern European Council and UCC to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada. And I know that the government of Canada is listening to us together, to our voices. So thank you for what you're doing. And we'll share some more information on some of the activities happening on Sunday across Canada later on our Facebook page as well.
Thank you, Ihor.
That was an excellent perspective to start our discussion. So next we're going to turn to Dr. Olga Onuch, who teaches at the University of Manchester and who will tell us more about mass mobilizations and her perspectives.
Thank you very much, Ihor, and thank you, Alena, for your wonderful and heartfelt introduction. I think many of us are with you and other Belarusians in solidarity. So first off, I want to give just a shout out to Leonid Tarasevich, who is a Belarusian artist by descent who lives on the border. He lives in Poland on the border with Belarus, and he organized many different music and rock festivals for democracy in the 1990s, and to all contemporary artists that are doing a lot of their own creative activism currently in Belarus. There's one particular artist who has made new contemporary protest posters. I have tweeted about it. It's an unnamed individual, and I urge you all to check that those posters out and support that creative activism. But some of you might know, some of you probably don't. I study mass mobilization. I've been studying mass mobilization in Eastern Europe and Latin America for about 15 or so years. And once again, we see a sea of ordinary citizens spill out onto the streets of a capital city. Now, I say these are ordinary citizens because in normal times, they may or may not vote, they may or may not pay taxes, they may or may not, and typically they are not, rather, members of opposition parties or organizations, and they're not usually in the business of protest. And to be clear, this is, an attempt at a mass protest is not new in Belarus. We have seen many attempts in the past. In fact, I even tried to study the so-called Jeans Revolution back in 2006. There have been the parasite tax protests and others. And yet we always had this feeling, those of us who study mass mobilization, that it's just not quite there. It's not quite going to happen in Belarus. And man, did Belarusians not surprise all of us? This is definitely a moment of mass mobilization. And please note, I don't use the word revolution. Yeah, this is a moment of mass mobilization because it's a moment when institutional or electoral politics fail. So when this happens, people tend to vote with their feet, as it may be, right? I would say the main tipping point into mass mobilization was about Thursday, Friday of last week, right? By the time we see the flood, that's Sunday, right? Where we see the sea of people everywhere in different cities around Belarus. And so that national protest event that we saw over the weekend, that's really like the revealing of the bottom of an iceberg after an old ship has hit it. What comes next, and this is why I do not call it a revolution, is not known, right? How revolutionary this moment will be is still to be determined. But other things that are very important about this event is that very early on, we observed an impressive cross-cleavage coalition forming. And we saw that cross-cleavage coalition, specifically the workers' strikes happening a lot sooner than we have in other cases. So be it in Ukraine, or be it in Venezuela, or Argentina, or Egypt, or Lebanon, or the other many cases that me and my team have studied, we haven't seen this kind of cross-cleavage formation so quickly, right? We see it a little bit later on, which is really, truly impressive for those of us who study this. And we saw defections also very early on. First, they were low-ranking officers and former officers, as many of you have seen. Then there were ambassadors and the state television workers. Obviously, they have been replaced currently, but nonetheless. Now, in this moment of mass mobilization, it was much more likely to have happened, not just because of the elections, and I have some data to back that up in a second, but because of a mass tactical failure by Lukashenko. So 7,000 plus arrests in less than 4 days is a really, really bad idea when you don't exactly know who are you looking for. Yeah, so it's not a targeted, but it's a mass arrest. And so what happens is Lukashenko essentially imprisoned a cross-section of Belarusian society. And this is actually something I quote from Danilo Polishchuk, who was a student at the Monk Center at the University of Toronto. And when you have a cross-section of society now in one room discussing how much they hate the regime, they go home, they go to their different families, they speak to their different networks, right? Or they may not go home and their different families are gathering outside of the prisons. And very quickly, a large cross-section of society becomes directly invested in the mobilization. So what's different from other cases, I just want to mention, specifically the geospatial nature of these protests. The cross-Belarus diffusion, the regional diffusion, it's much more widespread and much faster than what we saw in other cases. And certainly much more widespread and faster diffusion than in Ukraine in 2013-14. And I think that in itself is shocking to protest scholars. But what worries me now is that the defections seem to have slowed down. And the state has started to employ these targeted tactics of repression. Specifically, police are working with factory management, as Alena already mentioned, and also dispersing smaller crowds. Today, there was a dispersal of a small crowd of female protesters with flowers. Now, you have to be a particularly under threat regime to disperse a group of 20 or so women holding flowers. I want to give you just very quickly some data we've been collecting. So I am one of the principal investigators of a project called Mobilize, and we study protest and migration in Ukraine, Morocco, Poland, Argentina, and now Belarus. And we launched our online survey over the last few days. I just checked right now, and we have about 6,000 respondents already in this online survey. So it's truly impressive. We're generating it via social media online in the snowball sample. I can tell people more on the methodology should they want to ask. And it's currently still running. Now, everything I say here on forward, please treat it with a huge grain of salt. It is not for news reporting, but nonetheless, I think these are some important findings. And I'm reporting findings only based on about 1,200 respondents who filled out the full survey as of Wednesday, Okay, so the picture might be a little bit different. Generally speaking, in our sample, how many protested? Well, we have about 70% of people that are considered protest participants in that they reported protesting on site in person. But if we extend the definition of protest participation to also being engaged in online activities, that number grows to about 80% of those answering our survey. But we should note we have people who didn't protest, and we also have 1% of respondents who say they protested in support of Lukashenko. In our entire sample, most people that did protest turned to street marches. So about 40% reported in our entire sample having joined a street march, 36% joining a human chain, and 20% joining a labor strike at work. Only about 2% say they engaged in street blockades, and they also gave us a slew of other responses that we need to code, because obviously what people see as different types of activities is different to what scholars see. When did they join in? Well, in terms of our sample of protesters, 45% of our protesters in the sample joined in prior to the 11th of August, and about another 30% joined between the 12th and 16th. Now, how many times do they protest? 65% of the protesters in our sample say they protested more than once, and 99% of that more than one time protest is in marches. 50% of people said they protested on the 17th, which was the mass protest on the weekend. Now, what media do they use? We asked, what is your most trusted source about the protest? What is your least trusted source on the protest? I don't think I need to report that one. What information do you most often use to understand the protest and know where to go? And what do you use normally for information about politics? Generally, overwhelmingly, they use YouTube and Telegram, and they get their information about where to protest from the internet. Another 90% said that they also just saw people protesting, so that's how they know where and how and when to protest. But when we asked them what did they do when the internet was disconnected, 63% said they had to rely on word of mouth and communication with people, either directly talking to friends, family, and neighbors, or sending SMSs. So 58% received information from friends, 26% from coworkers and neighbors, but only 4% received any information about the protest from political parties or opposition organizations. Now, this just underscores how actually the opposition parties and opposition organizations are not very well connected to the mass protest group. Now, this can actually be quite dangerous when you're wanting to coordinate the protests and negotiate on behalf of them. Why did people protest? Well, 98%, it's actually not just the elections, and this is really fascinating. 98% of those who protested said they protested first and foremost because of the mass arrests and detentions of other protesters. That was their push, that was their trigger. Another 95% say just Lukashenko has been in power for too long. But the third most popular response of why people protested is they want to secure a better economic future. The fourth most popular response was wanting to defend democracy. And the fifth most popular response was the election result itself and it being fraudulent. I think what's interesting is very, very close to the election result itself as a trigger is the fact that about 82% of protest respondents believe that Lukashenko mismanaged the COVID pandemic. So there you have the top reasons why people are telling us they protested. I should note, we also ask about things. Did you just join in because you think it's fun to do? And did you just join in because you got paid? And we do have some people responding positively to that, but it's about 1 respondent for having been paid and 2% because it was fun to do. So this just underscores that the rumors about these sorts of things are false and inaccurate. This is truly surprising for those of you who are engaged in these protests abroad. I think this is incredible because I've never seen a number like this. We ask people, who did you go to the protest with the first time you protested? And 60% said they went on their own. When I say that, I get shivers through my body because that is not typical. Only 40% said they went with family friends. About 17% said they went with colleagues. 18% said they went with coworkers or neighbors. Now, that is impressive. When you are under threat of the risk of arrest and violence, to be joining in a protest on your own is truly incredible, and we should be in awe of that. When we ask people what the main slogan is, it's about Lukashenko leaving, or Lukashenko Avtozak. Nothing surprising there. But we also asked respondents, and here is where I'm going to leave off my comments. But what do they think this moment is called, or does it have a name? Some told us it doesn't matter what the name is. I don't care what it's called. The responses we suggested weren't very popular. They were completely split, or people didn't agree with them whatsoever, but they did give us their own suggestions. And we have hundreds of suggestions. I'm not going to name all of them, but I did group them into a few themes. The first theme is clearly whether it's a revolution or an evolution. The second theme of whether it's a fight, so a fight for rights, a fight for truth, a fight for justice, fight against lies. Third theme is women. This should be called a women's revolution, or a female revolution, or female evolution. Another theme is for freedom of Belarus, for freedom of and independence, marches against violence and freedom. Another theme is peace. A lot of people think that these should be called the peaceful protests when these go down in history. There's a theme of dictator, a nation against a dictator, or ripping blue fingers from the chair revolution. And then, of course, there's this that we've seen in Ukraine, that this is a revolution of dignity, many people have told us. This is a revolution of honor and dignity. And finally, that this is a flower revolution. So that's from the voices of the protesters themselves. Thank you very much for listening.
That's fascinating stuff, Olga. That's hot off the presses, and we're getting lots of comments and questions about that. So I'm sure we'll talk more about it when we get to the discussion. Thank you very much. So next, we've invited Dr. Alexander Lanushka from the University of Waterloo. Floor is yours, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'd like to express my solidarity, of course, to the very brave protesters who are taken to the streets in Belarus and even outside of Belarus, because as Alena mentioned in her very eloquent remarks at the beginning, those who are not in that country still face the repressive measures meted out by Lukashenko's brutal regime. So I've been asked to talk about the likelihood of Russia's military intervention and what the protests might mean for the future with respect to the wider security context. Most of my remarks are going to pertain, however, to the likelihood of Russian military intervention. Now, to take on this question, it really depends on what we mean by Russian military intervention, because to some extent, Russia is already involved in Belarusian affairs. The two countries are formal treaty allies by way of their membership in the Collective Security Treaty Organization. They cooperate in military affairs to a certain extent. They've engaged in joint military exercises that have gripped the headlines here in the West. Russia does not really have much of a direct military presence in Belarus, really involving a naval communications center as well as a radar station, and has used an airfield. That being said, we should keep in mind that Russia still exerts tremendous influence through other channels. Virtually all high-ranking Belarusian military personnel, including even the Chief of General Staff, Major General Alexander Volfovich, have been trained in Russian military academies. Now, there's a very reasonable debate as to how loyal the military is to Lukashenko, not to Russia. Some even go as far as to argue that Belarusian armed forces are a mere extension of Russia's. I think that is a bit of an exaggerated view. I think we do see some daylight between Minsk and Moscow. And I think we've seen Lukashenko assert strategically at times his own autonomy. But there's still no doubt, all that said, that through these military elite networks, Russia can gain a lot of information and exert some sort of indirect control. Now, what that all is to say is that as far as the higher ranks are concerned, we should just not expect major defections from the military to the opposition anytime soon. And indeed, as my panelists have remarked, we've seen defections slow down in number. And that might prove critical because defections, at least according to the political science literature, become much more widespread if everyone believes that the regime is teetering on the verge of collapse. But if so long as that belief is not there, then the military might remain on the side of the incumbent government. Now, there's some tendency to view the present crisis through the lens of what happened in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014, but we must emphasize that there are huge differences that suggest that some overt form of military intervention, whether through columns of Russian armor pouring over the border or little green men popping up in strategic sites, is unlikely for now. And I think 3 points are worth mentioning, even if Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov had said that the crisis in Belarus constitutes a struggle for the post-Soviet space. The first point is that, again, notwithstanding the bravery and the courage of the protesters in face of mass brutality, Lukashenko remains in control, with insiders still loyal to him and the coercive apparatus of the state largely intact. The Kremlin might find Lukashenko annoying. There have been disputes in the previous years. They might even see him as the author of his own present misfortune. But I think the signs point to him, to the Kremlin at least, betting that he can still persevere, presumably in the belief that he can wait out the protests. He can use brute force here and there, as Olga had mentioned, in an increasingly targeted fashion, such that he can perhaps outlast the opposition. The second point is that if an overt military intervention remains unlikely so long as Lukashenko appears to be firmly in control, it's also going to be very costly. There's some debate as to the cost of the annexation of Crimea for Russia. Some say it's been very costly, some have not, that the Russian economy has been willing to absorb it. To be sure, the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia have been very costly. But all that said, Belarus is a much larger territory. It's about 8 times the size of Crimea, if I recall correctly, about 5 times the population, which may be pro-Russian, as some argue, but not exactly pro-intervention. And so given the current economic state of Belarus, it will be a very difficult territory to govern and administer for quite some time. Its economy is in free fall, not least because of COVID-19 and Moscow recently closing tax loopholes that have affected energy subsidies that Belarus has used to generate cash. That being said, some covert intervention is possible. After all, one method that Lukashenko has used to break, so to speak, the strike by the staff of Belarusian state television is to import basically Russian journalists and groups thereof. So that might be a much more likelier form of intervention that we already do see happening. The other thing to note, and then this is the third point, is that we might be overlearning a little bit from the experience of Crimea in 2014, because it was an event that saw little green men pop up in strategic sites, controlling territory, intimidating local populations, and so forth. But that's in some ways an incomplete view of what happened in February and March 2014, in the sense that at that time back then, Russia was undertaking a major military buildup near Crimea or around its Western European territory that suggested that something was afoot that was not strictly defensive. One has to recall that prior to Crimea, Russia had undertaken fairly comprehensive readiness initiatives that involved as many as 150,000 military personnel with units involving airborne troops, vessels from the Baltic and Northern fleets, as well as elements of a tank brigade. There had been some activity near the Belarusian border, but nothing of the sort that we saw prior to the annexation of Crimea appears to be taking place. And indeed, we have to remember that even within Crimea, prior to that annexation effort, Russian military assets were already stationed there so as to facilitate the effort. So we're not seeing sorts of movements made by Russia in or near Ukraine in 2014 as we are now. There are still military movements. They're just undertaken by Belarusian armed forces with respect to the western part of its territory, specifically in the area near Grodno. Interestingly enough, there have been reports that the Belarusian General Staff refused to allow a military transport aircraft of the Russian National Guard to transport about 155 people and 3 tons of cargo that were intended for the Belarusian Interior Ministry. That suggests perhaps that there is an interest for having some sort of special forces deployed to Belarus. Details, however, remain scant, and we can read different theories into what exactly has happened. I suspect that the Belarusian military believes that it can handle the ongoing crisis on its own, notwithstanding the pedigree of its officer corps. Now, as much as I say that an overt military intervention is unlikely for now, I obviously have to provide some caveats. You know, I might be the typical academic in saying this, but of course, anything is to some extent possible. And indeed, if we look at the record of Russian behavior, there have been a number of instances of experts being caught off guard no matter their predictions. Now, many did not foresee, for example, Crimea, yet it happened. Others did not foresee Russia fighting a traditional war against Georgia in 2008. It did. People did not think that Russia would intervene in Syria. It did. And when it did intervene in Syria, people thought that it would get involved in a major quagmire. It didn't. So Russia is a very hard thing to predict. But considering all the elements that I've enumerated, I think there is some skepticism as appropriate and warranted for thinking that an overt military intervention of what we've seen elsewhere in Ukraine and Georgia is not likely to happen anytime soon. It could still happen if the Kremlin believes that has no other option, but I think it has plenty of options prior to that contingency. As for regional implications, my remarks will be necessarily brief because so much depends on how things turn out. My interpretation of these protests is that they ultimately want greater freedom of expression, for the government to abide by its constitution, as well as for the very salient economic concerns that many citizens have, not least because of what's going on in the region, to say nothing of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's no intent, it seems, to seek a Western alignment. This was a feature of what had happened in Ukraine. This is not an orange revolution. We don't see flags of the European Union in protests. And so I think it would be a mistake, as some have, to see Belarus as some sort of East versus West geopolitical struggle. I think that plays in to Lukashenko's narrative. And indeed, in the last few days, he's been playing up so-called provocations by NATO countries. In fact, I think today or in the last 24 hours, he has singled out the United States for instigating the crisis in Belarus, pointing to various nefarious elements in Warsaw and other NATO capitals. I think we should, not, use language that smacks of some sort of geopolitical struggle, because it's not necessarily a geopolitical struggle. I don't think Belarusian citizens see it that way. This is not analogous to sort of color revolutions that might have had that sort of tinge. And so, we should avoid such rhetoric, because that only plays to what Lukashenko is doing, which has been his way of trying to cast aspersions on the demonstrators and to justify his rule. So with that said, I'd like to turn over to
Thanks,
my
Alex.
panel.
That was very interesting, and we'll get back to some of the points you made. Last but not least, our favorite former ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Waschuk, who has, I think, a geopolitical regional experience there. Romana, can you tell us about your views on sort of what's happening, the implications for Canada and the EU and all of our international partners?
Sure. Thanks, Ihor, and also thanks for all the other presentations, which have been extremely rich and info-packed. What is the Canadian angle? Like, why should Canadians care beyond the 100 people who have registered to attend, and maybe even some of us? We do not have a resident embassy in Minsk. The Canadian embassy in Warsaw is accredited. Trade is not hugely significant, at least goods trade isn't. And the Belarusian Canadian domestic constituency is really only now coming into its own and sort of activating itself. But Canada leads a military deployment on the northern border of Belarus. I think that's something people forget about. The Forward Presence Battalion in Latvia is borders on both Russia, but also on Belarus. So any even kind of performative provocation on the western border could have some implications for the NATO stance in a country like Latvia. We also have a training mission, so not active duty, but in Ukraine, south of Belarus, and also undertake air policing in Romania on a rotating basis. So this is one of the actually things that I had noticed in my time. Usually the complaints in Canadian foreign policy is that we talk big and don't bring the resources. Between the Baltic and the Black Sea, we actually have brought resources, but don't talk about them at all, because they were plugged in there for various reasons between 2014 and now. But Canada is one of the forward deployed NATO allies in the region. And therefore, any change in the behavior of Belarusian armed forces, or some either direct or hybrid intervention by Russian forces would change the security situation for the Baltics. They would feel themselves encircled largely, and of course would change the situation for Ukraine. It would have a far longer border that it would need to worry about than it does now. I mean, they now fret, but then they would need to actively worry. What Alena was mentioning about new versus old Belarus, I think it's interesting to see that in goods trade, Canada is connected to the old Belarus. Canada actually has a 9-to-1 trade deficit with Belarus. Belarus exports 9 times more to Canada than vice versa, of which over 2/3 is refined oil products. So it comes from the big state-owned refineries with product that ends up in Canada, about $45 million worth a year. But where I think we are possibly even more connected, but it's not very well quantified, is in the IT sector, which is New Belarus and the people who are enabling and largely, I think, driving the mobilization, but also probably driving the new diaspora reaction to what's happening. 45% of Belarus IT outsourcing, and it's the biggest and most successful modern sector of the economy, serves clients in the USA and Canada. And 30% serves clients in the EU. So it's 75% Western oriented in terms of the client base. And to a large extent, that's the sector that's enabled a fairly comfortable internal emigration for people in Belarus. But I think what's happened is that the cognitive dissonance and now the physical violence dissonance between their sort of virtual integration in the West through being in the same project, working group with somebody in California or Kitchener Waterloo is now bumped up literally against the Lukashenko regime reality. So I think in any reactions that we might make, you need to differentiate between the people in the sectors in Belarus we would want to ensure are supported and made whole. I wouldn't be trying to put sanctions on Belarus software exports to Canada, but there potentially would be scope for hitting a state sector, which is refined oil products, should push come to shove in that respect in reacting to developments. Secondly, and I guess Dr. Lanoszka talked about trying to avoid geopoliticization of the situation. My view is that it's happening anyway. And yes, indeed, it's primarily driven by Lukashenko and by the Russians. There is no way, despite what they've been saying for the past couple of days, that a distracted United States and August holidaying Europeans have somehow managed to organize these protests. There are too many people working from home with unstable internet connections to be able to pull that off. Probably the Belarusians are better sort of connected through Nechta and Telegram than many of the Westerners who are being accused of intervening. But simply because of where Belarus is, the place it has in both strategic space and Russian imperial identity, Belarusians don't even have to be anti-Russian. They simply have to say that they're not Russian to trigger all these Russian paranoid imperial reactions. And so the wide use of the white, red, white flag is, if you'll pardon the pun, a red flag to the Russians. Because when you say, but don't worry, it's only the flag of the 1918 Republic and then 91, 94, those are two periods of post-imperial humiliation for the Russians. And so psychologically, for that whole Chekist group around Putin, these are neuralgic things. This is going to sound terribly weird, but I'll defend myself by saying that I was listening to a podcast with a guy who wrote an academic study of conspiratorial thinking in Russia. There was a fantasy novel published in 2015 called Belaruski Nabat by a fellow named Alexander Afanasiev, which talks about after Ukraine, the next blow will come in 2020 in Belarus by nefarious forces, and then Russia will need, through its secret services, to fight back. You could say people write fantasy novels all the time. Mr. Afanasiev, though, also wrote fantasy novels about the Donbass, and then helped in implementing some of the ideological framework for the rebel republics in eastern Ukraine. So this kind of Russian paranoia industrial complex has been working and thinking about this for a while. So it's really hard to prevent them from launching into this narrative right now. We certainly should not unnecessarily facilitate it, but I think it's arrived already, and we're going to need to deal with it one way or another. And I think events planned for this weekend, including the Baltic human chain to the Belarus border, then a possible extension in Ukraine, the existence of the Lublin Triangle, which includes all of the former elements of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth except Belarus. These are all unrelated, partly unrelated aspects, but they just feed the Russian paranoia as well. So I think some main messages here: Canada, whether it likes to or not, is engaged because of our presence, and geopoliticization, despite what most people might want on the demonstrator side and certainly on the Western side, is happening regardless, and we need to be prepared to deal with it.
Thank you, Romane. Well said. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to slide over now to let Orest Zakydalsky, UCC Senior Policy Analyst, facilitate our question and answer discussion.
Hello, everyone. So thank you to everyone, all of our panelists. I'll say right away that we have about 15 or 20 minutes, so we are not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, for which I apologize, but such is life. I guess the first thing I would like to ask, and I think maybe Alena and Olga, what we haven't talked a lot about is the political opposition and Miss Tikhanovskaya and who these people are, and what is it that they would want to see happen. So I'll ask the both of you, and also this coordination council, I believe it's called, that was formed in the last few days in Belarus. And what are their kind of demands? What do they want? And how do you believe they see this unfolding in the next days and weeks? So Alena first, and then Olga, I think. And obviously, if anyone else wants to comment as well.
Yeah. So Tikhanovskaya and Kolesnikova and Tsepkalo, the three women who basically happen to be at the right time in the right place. They're not political leaders, and I think it all started for Kolesnikova and Tsepkalo as activism, basically to support the main candidates. And Tikhanovskaya, she said it many, many times, she went in for love to her husband and basically trying to save his dream, his vision. And I think that's why people widely admire her. This is something, very deep, very ancient, is like when mythical almost, when the man is in trouble, woman stands up, and she goes to great lengths to basically lend a hand and fix the situation. I think that's why a lot of Belarusian women sympathize with her, and men as well, because traditionally, the Belarusian society is quite patriarchic, and a lot of things are still not available to women, right? But in reality, women, they do the hard jobs. They keep families alive, they work hard, they basically go unrecognized for many, many years, and it's granted. There is no official feminist movements, there is no recognition for women in our country, but everybody knows basically things are run by women, except for politics. So that's why I think many people sympathize with her, because she showed, she uncovered this. And I guess I will let Ola continue.
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to comment on who are the people in the coordination council and where did they come from and what are their demands. I mean, I have been following this, and some scholars have been reaching out to the coordination council. Of course, I'm not gonna say their names publicly, but there is an exchange specifically between Ukrainian experts and the coordination council. But I think what is important, that it's really not, the coordination council is important in itself, and they have made some demands, and they are now coming under various pressures, and they are being asked to come in for interrogations. They are being threatened with having broken the law. So there is this attempt by the state to quell this organization. But I just want to, on the coordination council, what happens there will be really important, and perhaps even more important than the protest. The protest must keep going for the coordination council to have power to negotiate. That certainly is the case. But in past moments of mass mobilization, be they in Ukraine in 24 or 2014, or in Argentina or elsewhere, what happens amongst this elite now, this elite game that goes on, is incredibly important. So is the coordination council truly coordinated, and is it able to control the information channels? That will be very important for its work going forward. Does it have access to interlocutors within the regime, right? Are there people from within the regime that are willing, informally, privately, through different channels, to speak to them? This was incredibly important in 2004 in Ukraine. Kuchma had interlocutors. He reached out to the Yushchenko camp and to activist camps, right? So there's a lot of back channel conversations happening. Does the coordination council have that access? Are they willing to engage? And are they willing to engage in this information exchange game? And if they are, that will strengthen their position and will lead Lukashenko and other regime outsiders that are outside of this information exchange to make mistakes, miscalculate, and that will likely lead to their fall. But without this element, I think it's going to be very difficult to negotiate from a position of power. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that point.
Alex or Roman on that, do you have anything to add? No. Okay. So the next question is maybe more to Alex and Roman, which is on the likelihood of the EU mediating. Is this something that Lukashenko is likely to even entertain? What leverage does the EU have in terms of actually, forcing the regime into some sort of mediation, which is, something we saw in Ukraine in 2004, much less successfully in 2014, but we did see it there too. And so is that a potential off-road or for Lukashenko or not? You guys are muted.
Okay.
No.
I think not terribly. They've made the offer directly and indirectly. Albania and Sweden, but probably driven by Sweden through the OSCE, have made the offer and it has not been taken up. I think the degree to which Lukashenko has kind of thrown himself on the tender mercies of Putin means accepting European involvement of any sort would be an unacceptable sign of weakness, and allowing them to infiltrate the common union state space as it's now sort of being redefined.
I agree. I think the European Union has little leverage here. I mean, does not have no leverage. It could impose sanctions targeted against members of the regime, for one. But I agree that there's very little interest on Lukashenko's side, at least, to negotiate in good faith with the European Union. Even the European Union has made some tactical errors, at least at the rhetorical level, with one high-ranking official saying that Belarus is not even a part of Europe. So that, does not necessarily help matters on the ground. But as far as I see, Lukashenko has evinced very little willingness to de-escalate the situation. In fact, I think in the last 48 hours, he's shown a willingness to revisit some repressive measures. So the European Union is not powerless, but it's not as well equipped to manage the situation. Again, it's not like 2014 where there was an association agreement that was at stake. There's no such thing here, so that sort of limits options on the table.
Can I just jump in on the EU thing? I think I agree wholeheartedly with my colleagues on the panel. But one element might be that Russia might bring in an EU representative in any negotiations to legitimize them, right? Similarly, in the Minsk negotiations, other people need to be at least kind of part of the game in order to legitimize what's happening. But I also want to say that even though the support for the EU amongst the general population, even though that is certainly not a major issue, this is a moment that's a critical juncture that can turn it into a major issue. And we've seen it in the past in different countries, right? So we've seen how moments of mass mobilization actually bring the general population onto a different policy preference. And that was certainly in Ukraine. In 2004, the majority of Ukrainians did not actually want to join the EU. And that changed over time. Actually, that changed with the war more so than anything else. So I think those two things are rather important.
Okay, we've got time, I think, for two more questions. The first one, and I'll leave it to you to decide who answers. In the event that the opposition is successful in ousting Lukashenko or driving him for power or creating some sort of negotiated way out of this. How does that change Russia's calculus? Like, if there were, let's say we come to a scenario where in a year or whenever, 6 months, there's something approaching a free and fair presidential and perhaps even parliamentary election in Belarus. Does that actually play into Russia's hands in some way in creating a space for, people who are closer to accepting a, union state taking power, and in this case, quite democratically? And is that a scenario that the Russians are looking at and exploring? So I don't know who's best to answer that, but I'll leave it to you guys to decide.
I could take the first stab at that. So I completely agree with what the ambassador said earlier, that geopoliticization is happening whether we like it or not, because at least on their side, they have every reason to play up these sorts of threats in order to justify what they're doing. I guess when I was making those remarks earlier, I had in mind some of the conversations that are actually happening in places like Poland about whether to view this issue through a geopolitical lens. Because there's a tendency to think amongst many Western analysts that Russia only cares about Belarus because it's some sort of buffer zone that separates it from NATO Europe. And I think that view is mistaken because, and I think we've seen this literally in the last 36 hours with the poisoning of Navalny, that the Kremlin has much more than geopolitical concerns on its mind, that it is worried about political opposition. Now, whether the Kremlin is directly implicated in Navalny's poisoning is up for certain debate. But I certainly take the view that it is fearful of any sort of demonstration effect that mass mobilization of the sort seen in Belarus could actually have some sort of effect in Russia, not least because we are seeing protests, especially in Khabarovsk, that might spell some sort of trouble for the regime, not least because the economy is contracting and so forth. So who knows what the actual behavior would be several months' time if the opposition is successful. But Russia certainly sees the problem more than just Belarus being a potential buffer zone that could be lost. I think there is certainly a much more political angle to it at that.
Can I just say, I'm not a person to speak on this. Orest, when I have private opinions on things, I don't like to voice them publicly, and that's certainly not what I'm going to do right now. But I know people who know more than I do on this topic. So I just want to say that my PhD student, Alena, who might be actually on the call, is studying this interaction in her PhD during the lead up to the Ukrainian conflict. And she might have some research out soon that might be helpful. But also I want to take the opportunity to mention Alexander Hartsimenko, who is a postdoc at Oxford, who studies Telegram, specifically in activism in Russia and Belarus. Volga Chernish, who is an assistant professor at MIT, and she knows a great deal about Belarus. And Sasha DeVogel, who is a PhD student in Michigan, also studying the history of mobilization in Belarus. So these are some voices that we might want to turn to in the future.
Roman or Alena, anything to add?
I will try. Oh, sorry. I'll just have from a layperson not connected to politics. I think for sure they will try to use the situation because we've seen in the past, in 1996, when Lukashenko was at the verge of impeachment, Russia basically helped him very much, and I don't think they will basically hold off this time. They will try to manipulate as much as possible and to gain more control over the Belarus.
I have fewer scruples than Dr. Onuch. I think if there is an off-ramp, it will create more of an autonomous space for different ideas and identities to swirl around, including potentially a pro-Russian one, but that would not be the most likely one to prevail. So the Russians would be, I think, very worried about this. I think that overthinkers in the post-Soviet space who think this is all super cleverly thought out by masterminds in Moscow who have induced chaos to then suddenly, take Belarus even firmer in its grip, are on the wrong side of the conspiratorial thinking line.
Okay, we have one last question, and I think for Alena, it's where can we find information on the rallies that are coming up this weekend?
I think you can go to the Facebook of Belarusian Canadian Alliance, and I'm in progress today of posting from all Canadian cities, and I actually reached out to all Canadian coordinators and told them to connect with Baltic and Eastern European communities and their cities. So, but the main source would be the Facebook page of Belarusian Canadian Alliance. I'm posting all these events today, later.
Okay, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. We, I think, could keep going for hours and hours, but we would like to let our panelists go. So again, on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the Canadian International Council, thank you to all of our guests and all of our panelists for what I think was a very fascinating and timely discussion. We will try to organize more of these in the future. Thank you all for participating, for your questions. We will be posting this on YouTube and on Facebook and everywhere else, so you feel free to share it in a couple hours when it's out with folks who could not attend. So again, thank you, дуже дякую, and живе Belarus.
Живе. Thank you.
And
Thank you.